Hello, my name is Xander and welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to explore the use of serverless architecture and build a REST API using Amazon's serverless infrastructure. In order to build our REST API in this tutorial, Amazon provides us what is known as Lambda Functions, which are essentially just serverless runtime environments where we can execute code. In this tutorial, we're going to go through a CRUD example. So we will create 4 Lambda functions, 4 functions which will create data in a database, return data from a database, update the data in a database, and of course, delete data in a database. Now, if you're completely new to AWS services, there can be quite a lot of setup required for this. So the first step here in this tutorial is installing and initiating the SAM application. So I won't take you through step by step everything that needs to be installed because the AWS guides are pretty comprehensive, for your operating system. So I will guide you through the process and try and get you to the endpoints for us to then start to actually develop our application. And once we're all set up, we go through deploying an application. So SAM is serverless application model. So we're going to be utilizing the AWS SAM CLI command line interface to accomplish building and deploying our application onto the AWS services. In this tutorial, we have selected Amazon's Dynamodb, which is a fully managed serverless key value NoSQL database. Of course, that's not the only database that you can utilize for this setup. It's just what we've chosen in this tutorial. So once we have everything set up, we can then, in the latter part of this tutorial, then go ahead and start to build our Lambda functions so that we can create, return, update, and delete data from and to the database. If you are new to AWS services, it does sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming to begin with. I normally joke and say, well, after the first 500 hours, you'll feel as though you're starting to get to know it. And it does sometimes feel like that with AWS. And it's as a moving feast as well. They're progressing and moving these services forward. So there's a continuous learning pathway, I think, with AWS. So anyway, back to our application here. Right, so this is essentially what we're going to be setting up in this tutorial. So here we have an end user. The end user, you and I, are going to make a request. That request is then going to be handled by the AWS Amazon API gateway. Now, essentially, this gateway, we're going to set up paths to other resources. And of course, we're going to build a CRUD application. So we're going to need a pathway set, if you like, for both post, get, put, and delete options. So the user is going to send a request and they're going to request either to post data to a database, add data to a database, to get data, to change data in a database, put, or to delete data. So we need to set that up in Amazon AWS API gateway. And then that's going to forward that information then to our AWS Lambda function. So in this scenario, we are going to have a separate Lambda function for each request type. And then that needs to be connected to some sort of permission control, because obviously we don't want anyone to be able to make a request. Potentially, we want to add permissions to control who and how can access our database. And then finally, of course, once that's been configured, we then have actually access to our database. So we are going to need to build our database. And that is a really simple process with Dynamodb so that we can add and delete and perform all the operations on the database. Now, it might seem quite a long-winded process. It looks like we're going to need to set up these 4 services individually. And yes, we will write code which will provide instructions on how this should be configured. However, this will all be managed through the AWS SAM CLI. So let's get started. We need to go through all the installations. Now, installing the SAM application can be quite tricky depending on what operating system you have. Amazon does provide guides on how to do that, but I feel as though it doesn't take you through everything that you need. And so what you need to do, I think, in my opinion, is go through this process here to start off with. So create a new AWS account if you haven't already done that, and then just grab your AWS security keys and have those ready. And then you need to install Git, and then that would then take you through, and I think you'll then be ready then to install AWS command line interface. And then once you've done that, then I recommend you install the SAM CLI. So these are the steps I think that you should go through. You can see it's quite a long-winded process. If you are completely new to development, it is and might take you some time to get all this right. So let's just go through the first step. Now, creating an AWS account, you can do that very easily. Just go to Amazon AWS, create a new account. So I don't think you need a credit card or anything like that. It should be all free. So once you've done that, then you need to create an AWS security key so we can access our AWS account through this CLI. So to do that, what you need to do, let's go into this. Okay, so that's where we need to get to. So once you've logged into AWS, you'll be presented with the console home. It might look slightly different to mine because I've accessed some of the services, and you can see those are recently visited. So what you need to do then is if you go down to your security credentials here, what you'll need to do is select the access keys. So there are two keys in actual fact that will be created, the access key and the secret key. So go ahead and just download that as a CSV. There'll be an option, and then that'll be handy for later. So like I said, because we are accessing AWS through the CLI, we're going to need those keys in order to create that interaction. So next up then, once you've created your keys, go ahead and install Git if you haven't already done so. And the reason why we need to install Git is because we are going to clone down an existing repository to initially set up a Hello World application. So download Git, and then just select the operating system, download, go through the installation process, and that should be just about done. So to check that is working, so once Git has been installed, here I'm just in Visual Studio Code, but you can open up your terminal. If you just type in Git and then version, that should tell you what version of Git you currently have installed. So that's now Git installed, hopefully. And now we need to move on to the AWS command line interface. So let's do that. So let's just type in AWS CLI. That should take us to the AWS command line interface. So the reason why we're going to need this is because if you remember, we've got our security keys, and we're going to need to build that connection from our CLI to AWS so we can utilize all these tools. So let's go ahead and do that. So AWS command line interface, and then you can see that we've got Windows, Mac, and Linux again. So just go ahead and download and run. So once that's installed, same process again. If you just type in AWS version, that should then give you the version of AWS that's installed. So here I have AWS 2.5.2. So once you've installed AWS, let's go for AWS configure. So open up your terminal. It doesn't have to be in Visual Studio Code. It could be in your terminal. So AWS configure, and then it's going to ask you for your access key and then your secret key. You can see that I've already typed them in, and that's why you're seeing the dashed out there, the starred out characters values. So I've already typed that in. So type in your key and your access key that you obtained earlier. And then also then select your region. So here I'm using EUS 2. Yours might be slightly different, of course, but just make a note of that because we'll utilize that throughout our application. Default output format, don't worry. And there we go. So now that's set up for us to then move forward. So with that now configured, the last point now is to install SAM CLI. So again, just go over to your search engine. I've typed in SAM CLI install, and there's a top option here. And that takes you to the option where you can select your operating system. So here I'm using Mac. So I'm just going to select Mac. You can see on the Mac, create an AWS account. So we've done that. Configure IAM permissions. So we've already set up our AWS configure at this point. So we're not going to install Docker and set it up on Docker, but there is options for that. And then now we're going to install. So here we're going to install through brew. So it's just a case of following these commands here to follow that. So once you've done that, install SAM CLI. So brew tap AWS /tap, blah, blah, blah. SAM version. So that then confirms it's installed. So just go through those basic steps there. And then we go back to our terminal and we can just ensure that's installed. So SAM version. And here I'm using 1.43. So once you've got to this point, and I do hope you have got to this point and it hasn't put you off already, let's go ahead and open up a new folder. So on the desktop here, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this AWS. Yeah, I'm just going to call it AWS and press open. So now we're ready to go ahead and to set up our API. So I haven't really taken any time to introduce the SAM CLI. By all means, go and read the documentation. But in short, this is a very specific AWS command line option for working with serverless applications. You are going to see this in effect. The SAM CLI, we will go through and we'll be utilizing template files. We're going to write that in YAML, but we could also use JSON. And we're going to utilize YAML files to configure each of our architectural components. And then we'll configure, and that way we'll configure our serverless applications. So we've installed AWS SAM CLI. So let's just go through a basic kind of set up a hello world application to begin with. And then we'll use that framework then to build out our own application. So we know that SAM is working, so we've already done that. So let's go for SAM, and we're going to initialize a new project. We'll give this a name, and we'll call this, we're going to make it a product API. So we'll call this product API. Okay, so we're presented with a few options here. We're going to use the AWS Quick Start templates. Maybe there is a template we already have, maybe on GitHub, etc. So we could use the custom template location for that. But we're going to utilize, assuming we're completely new to AWS here, we're just going to use a template. And you can see there's a few different templates here, and we're just interested in the Hello World example. So option number 1 there. And I realize at this point I've been cropped here, but I'm going to select number 1. So let me just see if I can bring that up. There we go. So you can see my console. So I've selected number 1. Right, so now it says use the most popular runtime of the package and package type. So here by default, Python and zip is the default. You can select, if you press no here, you can then go on and select different technologies, Java, JavaScript, etc. But we'll be using Python here. So I'm just going to select Y for yes. And then that's going to clone down. So this is why we installed Git, so that we could automatically clone down a template. So at this point, we have a complete application, if you like, with everything that is needed in order to now deploy onto AWS. So we have a YAML file here. So this file basically we'll be utilizing to define resources being the Lambda functions that we need to build, or whether that be the database. So that will then provision those services in AWS by defining them here in this YAML template file. So in addition to that, hello world here. So this is what we're looking at here is the actual Lambda function that's going to be built. And here we're going to build out our Lambda function and all the functionality. So we'll build some more folders here with the different CRUD, the CRUD services that we're going to build, or CRUD functions, sorry, that we're going to build. Apart from that, there's nothing else here that we need to know at this point. So once we have this in place, we can now go ahead and in our terminal, we can go ahead and deploy. So let's do that. So SAM deploy and guided. So what's going to happen now then is we're going to be asked a few different questions, but let's just go through this first. Right, so let's just make sure we're in the right folder. Okay, so you need to traverse into the folder. So CD and then the folder. So we need to actually use the deploy command inside of the folder here. So I've navigated into that, and now I can type in SAM deploy, and then we're going to use guided to begin with. So that's going to give us a few different steps here. So stack name. So we're going to build a stack, and I'll explain that shortly. But essentially that will have all the instructions based around what we're trying to build here. So let's just call this SAM app product API. Okay, so then select your region. So you can see that mine probably already has something selected. Maybe yours won't. So I'm using EUS2. Just make sure that is what we set up originally when we created the AWS configure. So confirm changes. So if you remember, sorry, I'll slow down. You remember when we went through the process of connecting our AWS CLI, utilizing our secret keys. We selected the region then, so just make sure it matches up. So confirm, show you resource changes. Okay, so confirm, yep. And then allow Sam Cli IAM role creation. So it's automatically going to create roles for us. That's exactly what we want. Disable rollback. So yes or no, it's up to you whether you want to include rollback if you make any mistakes, etc. So to begin with, I'm just going to disable that for now. Okay, so it says hello world function may not have authorization defined. Is this okay? So because we haven't set up any authorization or any permissions yet, this would be maybe an open function that could be accessible by anyone. So we're just going to say yes for now because we're just setting this up, but that may be something that we need to look at later, but not in this tutorial. It's out of scope of this tutorial. Right, so save arguments to configuration file. Yep. So we only want to do this once. So let's save that to a file, and then we can define our configuration file if we want to. I'm just going to press enter, and then the environment default. Yep, no problem. And there we go. So that now is going to start to provision and start to create the configurations for us to then provision all and everything that we need. Now, if we have a look up here, it does start to tell us what it is that is trying to do. And what's going to happen is when we create our Lambda functions, all this data is going to be stored on the simple storage AWS S3 simple storage service. And you can see that's going to create an S3 bucket for all of our data. So at the bottom here, if you read this through, you can see the changes that are going to be made and the resources that are going to be needed. So here, for example, we're going to create or provision a Lambda function. It looks like we're going to create an IAM role permission for that. Sorry, here's a Lambda function. It looks like we're going to set up a gateway to actually then forward information over to our Lambda function. And you can see what's happening here in general terms. So once we've done this, let's press Y. So then to actually deploy, and now we're actually deploying. So this is all going to be managed automatically for us. And like I said previously, everything has been set here in our template file in terms of the resources and services that we need. So for example, here we've set up a resource. This is a function. So this is going to set up an AWS Serverless function, a Lambda function. And these are the commands or instructions or attributes for that. Okay, so once that's done, we're now ready, we're all set up, and we're given some information here. So basically this information, this has all been generated. If you go down to this output here of the template file here, this is being generated through this output. And this is an optional step in your code. You don't have to have this. And you can see that that is basically just going to provide some instructions. Maybe in this case, it actually gives us the endpoint that we're going to use. So if I just move that up, you can see there's this value here. And this is our API endpoint. And this is how we're going to access our endpoint. So what should happen at our endpoint? So let's go back up here. So you can see what we've got here. This Lambda function is connected to this folder, this hello world folder, and this is our function here. So what's going to happen here is we're going to send a request to the endpoint that's been defined, and then we're going to return a message, hello world. Right, so if we go now back into our browser, open up a new tab, and then we're going to use that link to then access our endpoint. It then says hello world, and that just confirms that everything is now working. So now if we wanted to, we could drill down to the individual services and see what we've created. So for example, in Amazon S3 storage, you can see that we've got a new bucket there. If we were go into, for example, the API gateway, we're probably going to have some. So what do we build? We built is it SAM app product? I've got a few things going on here. So we had the hello get, there we go. So here's our API gateway kind of endpoint. And you can see that this is kind of a get request here. Now, what we have here, if you've not seen this before, you can see roughly what's going on here without drilling down too much here. We can then see how this is going to be connected to our Lambda function right here. We can go ahead and test this if we wanted to. So we can just press test here and you can see that we return hello world. So that gives us a little bit of more information if we need to. And when we're trying to diagnose any problems, that can come in handy. We can go straight over to our Lambda here. That would take us to our Lambda function. You can see that we have the gateway connected to our Lambda function. And this is our Lambda function. So you can see that's returning hello world. So if we go back to wherever the code was here, this piece of code here in our hello world app, that's going to then correlate to our lambda app.py here. So it wasn't my intention to kind of drill down to these individual components in this tutorial, but it gives you an idea, if you haven't used AWS before, how you can potentially drill down to some of these different components that you're now using. Something of interest that would be worth reading through or start to learning a little bit about is CloudFormation. So to try and summarize what this is here, essentially when we're working through SAM CLI, we are essentially building a stack. It's called a stack. A stack, for example, and in that stack essentially is a collection or a description of a collection of AWS resources that we want to provision and manage. And essentially that's what we've done here. We're creating a stack. So by creating our template here, we're defining the resources that we want. Eventually we'll add in a database, etc. We're defining our stack. So AWS CloudFormation is the service that gives us developers an easy way of creating a collection of related AWS resources and provisioning them and allowing us then to manage that provision. Let's now start building towards our CRUD functions. Now, the first step that we're going to now perform is build a Dynamodb table. So we can go ahead and just access that manually through the search here. If we just type in Dynamodb, that would take us to the AWS service. And from here, we can go ahead and create tables and so on. You can see that I've already created some tables in another application. So that allows me to view the tables. I can then go into the tables and start to explore them. So I use this to explore the tables here. And these are all the rows in this table. If you haven't started utilizing NoSQL databases yet, this is going to be quite a change from relational databases that you might be used to. Again, apologize, it's not my intention to drill down to the specifics here. We're simply going to build a new table and then start to perform some CRUD operations on it. But this gives you kind of an entry point to start looking around. If you're familiar to utilizing databases, you'll find some of the terminology is very similar. Now, the user interface for managing DynamoDBs, at least to begin with, it isn't the most intuitive front end or interface, sorry, that you might have used before, but you'll get eventually used to it, of course. So something that you can utilize if you don't want to utilize this interface to start to view your data, etc., is that we are provided a tool where we can download and install on our own operating systems to manage our databases from that software. And I don't know why I've explained it that way. You get the idea. It's a piece of software that allows us to manage our databases. So that piece of software is the MySQL or NoSQL workbench. So let's go ahead and just download that. So you should be able to access that from just typing in NoSQL AWS download. So that's the NoSQL workbench. Could have just typed that in, and you can see it's available on Mac, Windows, and Linux. So go ahead and download that. So once you've downloaded that, what you're going to need to do is just open it up and then go into the, again, not the most intuitive front end or interface, sorry. So go into the operation builder here, and what you'll need to do is just select add here and add a new connection. And what you're going to need then is your access ID key and your secret key. So you don't need the session token or IAM role here if you want to just use your access and secret key again. So select a region, access key, secret key, connect. And once you've connected, you'll then be presented with your active connections. And I think it's this one here. Nope, maybe not. go back, this one here, connection 2, that takes me to a table that I've already created. So you can see that, and you can see that I can drill down to that table, and then I can go ahead and start to interact with it. Now, again, I keep saying this is not the most intuitive interface here, or performing actions. Generally, you need to expand. So select the table, then expand, and you'll be given some different options. So if I wanted to run a scan, so a scan in terminology here is essentially running a query to grab data. So I can scan the product table. I can add some conditions if I wanted to, but I'm just going to run that. And you can see that it returns all the items. There's only one item in this table at the moment, so I've just returned the one. What I can do is generate code, and that can be useful to help me determine how I need to then perform the specific operations that are being performed here. Here's a scan, and it gives me the information that I need potentially on how to create a scan using code. Right, so let's go ahead and actually now build a table and get this set up. So I'm going to remove the hello world function from my resource. That's the first thing. And I'm just going to get rid of these two items here. I'll leave this last point here. So just in case we forget the endpoint, at least we've got the link outputted when we rebuild. Right, so with that in place, let's go ahead now and we'll delete this folder here called hello world. And then we'll go ahead and create a new folder called src. And then inside of this folder, that's where we're going to put our Lambda functions eventually. But first of all, we're going to provision a new database table. Right, so to do that, we just need to give it a name. So in the resources, I'm just going to call this item table. So that's the name of my table. It's going to be the name of my table, but this is the name of the resource, and that's going to be type. So here we're going to have a type AWS, and then that's going to be a Dynamo database, and we're going to create a new table. So instantly, we've already told AWS that we want this new resource, and we want a new Dynamodb table. So we just then need to think about the properties of this. So let's create some properties here. So table name. So I'm going to give this table name item, just going to be called items. Okay, so let's not forget the capital N. So at this point, you could drill down to all the information. If you go over to the documentation, look for AWS Cloud Formation, and then look for the Dynamodb. Here's going to give you all the information about all the different properties and attributes that you can apply in this section here. So if we want to represent an attribute for describing a key schema for the table and indexes, essentially we're going to create a new field. Then we're going to utilize attribute definition. So if we go back into our code here, let's do that. So if you're coming in from a relational database world, this is going to be a whole different world if you're not familiar with this. So here I'm not going to set out all of my rows in my table. I'm just going to define, in this case, keeping it nice and simple, a primary key of sorts. So let's go ahead and definitions. Yep. S. Okay, so we're going to define, for example, the attribute name. That's going to be ID. And then we're going to say, or define, sorry, the attribute type. And we're going to define that as a string. So if we roll down here, we can see that we have different properties. We can see the attribute types. We've got 3 attribute types: string, binary, and number. So once that's done, we're going to essentially just define that as the foreign key. So we're going to describe key schema, and then we're going to define the attribute name, ID, and then after that, we're going to say the key type. So in this case, apologies, key type is going to be hash. So again, back to the documentation, key schema here. It's just a case of reading through and becoming familiar. So hash, a partition key, the role that the key will assume, so a partition key. So again, if you're not familiar here, this is all terminology associated to how Dynamodb stores data as groups of attributes known as items. So here we have Dynamodb uses partition key values as an input to an internal hash function. And the idea is the output from the hash function determines the partition in which the item is stored. So essentially all we've done is create a primary key, if you like, in relational database terms, and that's the ID. Right, so with that in place, we now have our ID, we now have our key schema, and now we can define, or we can set the provision throughput. So provision throughput. Yep. And we've got two settings here. We've got the read capacity units. Sorry, capacity units. So we just set that as 1 for now. And then we also have the write capacity units. We set that to 1 as well. So in this case, the read capacity and write capacity units are setting the maximum number of consistent read or writes consumed per second before the Dynamodb returns a throttling exception. Okay, so let's just capitalize table here. So that's our item table. So I'm going to call this items table. Okay, you can call it whatever you like and follow along. So that's our resource. That's our new resource. Okay, so to now apply that new resource, we now need to do two things. So we'll go ahead and say Sam build. So we'll run the Sam build, and you can see that we're told that there is an error. So it looks like it's doing some validation checking here. So read capacity units. Looks like we've got incorrect string provisioned throughput. Okay, so we need the colon there. So let's go ahead and try and build again. So it looks like we built it successfully. So now we can just go ahead and deploy. So we'll select deploy. So what's going to happen now? You can read through this. It does make sense. We're told what's going to essentially happen. And it's going to then set up a plan. We're going to agree to that plan. Then it's going to commit that plan to the AWS services. So we've seen that there is some validation here of our template before we can go ahead and build. But what you might experience, one of the issues that you might have, and you probably have quite a few, is this waiting for chain set to be created. So that's just an indication really that potentially there is something wrong with your template. So in this case, I have not included the second colon here. So in actual fact, I need 2 colons here in my table. So if I go ahead and Control-C that in the board, go ahead and build again, and then go ahead and deploy. Hopefully this time, everything will be absolutely fine. But again, you might see this problem. So we've got an error here. So again, it's just indicating a problem. This time I've left here a double. So I'll remove that, and then we can give it a go again. Go for a deploy. And here we have the third error. So previously what we did, we removed a resource. That resource had a resource name, if you like. And the thing is down here, we're utilizing that resource name to produce some sort of documentation. So that isn't going to work for us. So what we're going to need to do here is just, because we don't have a name, let's utilize the item table here to then allow us to output this at the bottom here. We'll change that shortly. So we are told that the resource dependency doesn't match. And that's essentially what's happening here if you read through this. So this resource did not match. Therefore, we weren't able to create this output. So let's go again for the build and the deploy. And hopefully this time we won't have a problem. Okay. So we still seem to have a problem here. So let's have a look here. So we've still got serverless REST API. It looks like the output block of the template, it looks like we've still got an issue here. So let's just go ahead and remove this completely, and we'll just add this in a while. So all we're going to be left with is the item table. So let's give that a go. So go ahead and press Y and enter. We're now ready to go. So I tried to replicate some of the issues that you have. It's hard to replicate them all, but majority of the time it's going to be indentation or it's going to be some sort of syntax error. So what's happening now is it's provisioning all the new services that we've requested. In this case, it's our new Dynamo table. If we look through this list here, we're told the resource status, the resource type, and exactly what's happening here. We can see that we're deleting previous aspects. So we did get rid of the hello world function. So you can see that's been removed and there's associated resources to that is also then being removed. Right, so now we're done. We're going to be utilizing the workbench, but you can use the website for this. So if I go back into the workbench now, and then we're just going to do a refresh here. And you can see now I have a new table called items. So there's my new table. So let's now go ahead and try and populate this table. So we're going to go for a CRUD function, the first CRUD function, which is create. So here I'm just going to bring in the code and just explain it slightly. So here we go. So underneath resources, let's bring in the new resource. So here we're going to be defining a new Lambda function. So apologies, I'm not going to type this out. It's a lot easier if you are following this step by step, just to look through this, pause, and just copy this in. Otherwise, use the link in the video description and have a look at the repository. So this is very simple, and it is very much now a case of copy and paste once we start producing these Lambda functions. So here you can see the type is going to be a function. So we're going to create a Lambda function here. We've set up the code URI. That's a link essentially to where the code is for this function, and we'll set that up shortly. And then we have a handler, so there's a Lambda handler, and then the runtime we're using Python 3.9. Okay, so this does match the Python that we're currently using. Now, I think if you're, for example, set this to Python 3.5 and you don't have 3.5 on your machine, then that isn't going to work. So you do need to be careful to make sure that you're using the Python version or have a more advanced setup so that it does work. So runtime 3.9 Python, that's what's currently installed on my machine. And that is also then compatible within a Lambda function, for a Lambda function environment. Okay, so once we've got that in place, we have a create item. Let me just change this around. So we're going to create a new item, so event create item. Here we're going to now essentially define the path. So this is going to be the path to this resource, which is going to be /items. And then the table name was items table. So we just need to be careful of that. So our table name was called items. So that's pretty much all we've done here. We've created a path to the Lambda function here. Now we're expecting the method post. So a post being we're going to send data to the database. If you're not familiar with that, post, get, put, and delete. So that basically provides an instruction of what the API gateway is expecting. So let's just go back into let's go drill down back into the diagram here. So essentially what we've done now, we're not using products here, we're going to use items. The reason why that is because I've already set up something before here with that. So we're going to say items, apologies to change this. So this is get, add item, get item, update, delete item now. So essentially what we're doing here, we're setting up this Lambda function here. So we've defined the API gateway link to this, and we define the fact it needs to be post. So we're expecting a post request to this Lambda function. We're going to set up the permissions automatically, and then that's going to then send data to our database. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. We've got the policy here. So we're going to create a policy, a security policy. So we're going to use an existing policy, and that's going to be a Dynamodb or DB CRUD policy. And that's going to give you the privileges in order to perform this operation. So again, essentially behind the scenes here in the Amazon IAM, that's going to have pre-existing policies that we can utilize. And here we're just hooking into that policy and applying that to this Lambda function, if you like, to allow that privilege to be able to access the database and to then actually perform this post operation. So now we've got that in place. Let's go ahead now and create a new folder here. So inside of our SRC here, folder that we created earlier, we're going to create a new folder and we're going to call that create item. So inside of here, we're going to have the init file. And then also we then need a new file, which we're going to call app.py. Right, so I'm going to bring the code in step by step rather than typing it out, making loads of mistakes. So first of all then, we're going to bring in some resources. So first of all, Boto3. So if you aren't familiar with Boto3, basically it's the name of the Python SDK for AWS. So it's going to allow us to interact, create, update, and delete AWS resources utilizing Python. So here we've got JSON. It's going to be working with JSON. And we're going to use a UID for the database when we add new entries into a database. And then we're also going to add the date time. We're going to utilize that for the database too when we add a new entry. So here then we're going to create a new Lambda handler. And then we're going to set out an if statement. So here what we're going to do, we're going to capture the request. So the message or the request from the user. So we're going to say that if, for example, there's no body in the message, or else if the message is not from a post request. So if we're not sending a post request to this endpoint, then we're not going to do anything extra, because this is expecting, the next code is expecting us to be sending a post request in order for us to perform any actions. So if, for example, if we don't meet those requirements, we're just going to send a status code 400 back, bad request. Okay, so that basically just captures whether we're sending the right request to this endpoint. Right, so now we're going to define a few different parameters here. So we're going to define the table name and then the region that we're working with, and we can utilize that in our code. And we're just going to set that up because that might be used multiple times in the code here. The reality is we're going to keep it nice and simple. So first of all, we're going to define our table. So using Boto3 resource, we're going to go ahead and utilize the Dynamodb resource. So that's going to hook us in essentially to allow us to interact with the Dynamodb service. So next up then, we'll define the table that we're going to be utilizing, and that's the item table. So that's our table. And now we're going to say activity equals JSON loads message body. Okay, so activity. Right, so what's happening here then, message, notice that we're passing the message through here. So the message is essentially the user request. So the user request, in this case, the user is going to send data to the database. So this allows us to capture that information that the user sends, and then we can go ahead and capture that information. That information will no doubt be in the body of that message, and we're going to capture that in activity. So now what we can do is we can start to now set up the parameters to actually store that in our database. So we're going to make a new item in our database. We know that we have a key ID, and we're going to use UID4 to create a string there for that, a unique identifier. So we move across, and now we grab from activity, that's the information that's been sent from the user, grab from the message body. We're going to grab the item name. So that's then going to be passed and be prepared to then be sent into the database. And then we do the same for a description. And you can set up, this is essentially the data that we're going to store in a row in our database. So the price, and then is active, and then I'm just going to add the date. So here, this is why I'm using date time, just to add the date. So that's going to add the date. So essentially what you're looking at here is the data that's going to be passed into the database to create a new entry. So once we've done that, we now need to essentially run that query. Apologies for the zooming in, etc. So we then set up our response here. So that's going to be table.put item. So we're using put item here, and the table name, which we grabbed from our parameters above, and then the item. So that's going to be the params. So that's grabbing the data or setting up the data, and then we just pass that in essentially to our query to actually enter that into our database. So once that's in place, we can print the response, and then we can go ahead and return. So we return a status code of 201 and anything in the headers if we want to, and then we can go ahead and just send a simple message, new item created. And there we go. So that's pretty much our first Lambda function where we capture information from the user and then we go ahead and put that into the database. So let's just go back to our template here. So we have to bring that across. So we just need to make sure that is correct, the correct folder. So create items, then we use the default name app here for the actual logic of our application or of our Lambda function. Okay, so that looks like everything's okay. I'm not too sure what that is. Item table is not defined. Okay, so that's why. For some reason, I've got product here still. So just define that, make sure that's okay. Apart from that, I think everything is okay. So the only thing that we need to do here, we're going to be utilizing Boto 3. So what we're going to need to do here is set up a requirement file. So we're going to create a new file here called requirements.txt. And inside of here, I'm just going to tell AWS that I'm maybe going to need to utilize this resource here, so Boto 3. So that resource is potentially going to be required. Now, remember that potentially we can also run this locally. So by identifying the requirements, it can be quite handy to have that. Right, so I think we can close all that down. I think we're now ready to set this up. So one thing that we can do in our template down here, remember we've got the outputs. So it's always handy to have the endpoint because I always forget the endpoint. So we can just describe, I'm just going to copy and paste this over. So we're just going to add in here the description and value, and that just gives us the endpoint that we're utilizing. So just go for prod. Okay, so this is an API item endpoint. Items endpoint, there we go. So that's just it's not mandatory like you've seen or like I've said. That just gives us a way of identifying, remember this needs to be item API, that needs to be connected to our resource. So I'll give you some wrong, this doesn't matter. So the name here, this is irrelevant. Apologies, I made a mistake there earlier. So that doesn't matter at all. So we've got our serverless REST API. So let's just double check this. Yeah, I think we're okay. I think we're okay. I think this will work absolutely fine. Apologies. I think the problem before apologies, I didn't give you correct information there. So before we couldn't have this, I believe, because this didn't exist. We didn't have previously an endpoint, so it wouldn't have created this. So because we have now defined a Lambda function here, I think this is absolutely going to be fine now. So let's go ahead now and build. So we'll just go through the build process again. It looks like everything's okay, and then we go for the deploy. So this is going to take a few seconds to deploy. There's a few different services that now need to be recreated. So we're going to create a new Lambda function here. So that all needs to be uploaded and then created. We're going to create the endpoint for this. So we should be able to access this through /items with a post request. So we just press yes to that. So it looks like everything's okay. So let's go ahead and test this out. All right, so we've got our endpoint here. Now we need to post. So we're going to need some way of doing that. So whether you're using Postman, here I've got Thunder Client. It's all installed to keep it all nice and local. So this is Thunder Client. If you go into the extensions here and just search for Thunder Client, go ahead and install that. That will give you I call it a lightweight API resource here so we can test some endpoints. So let's go ahead and create a new request. Right, slightly small screen here, but we'll give this a go. So we've got our endpoint, which is this right here. So put that in. So that's our endpoint. Now we do want to make sure that we're going to items. So items /, and then we want to make sure that we're sending a post request. So let's just go ahead and do that, see what happens. Just bring that down. You can see that we get the 502 bad gateway. So it looks like we do have an endpoint here. Because, for example, if we didn't have items, press send, you can see here we have a completely different issue here. In actual fact, saying that, let's go back to our template, paths items. Okay, yeah, so that might exist. So we got forbidden here. Right, so with that in place, let's think about now what we need to do. So in our headers, there's nothing we need to do there, auth. Okay, so here then we need to authenticate ourselves in order for us to be able to access this resource. We can't just send to this. So we're going to need to utilize our access key and secret key. So go ahead and add that in. All right, so once you've done that, and maybe you've tried to test it, what you're going to see here in this list here of activity is a request that you've made. So what you can do here is you can save this to a collection. So give it a nice little name, and then select the collection, make a new one maybe. So I'm going to select AWS and press submit. So that's then going to go into your collection here. So what I have here in my collection is 3 predefined requests, predefined tests that I can perform on my endpoint. So here I've got post. Okay, so let's go ahead and just change this slightly to item name. So that's going to be item name. And then what I need to do here is just move that forward. So let's go ahead and just change the endpoint. So that's going to be prod items. Okay, so we've got items. So we're going to send. So in our body then, JSON, we're going to send the item names, description, price, and is active true. Right, so we've got that in place. So we've set up the auth, and now we've set up the body. So we should now be able to send that across. And you can see that we return. Let's bring that across here. You can see that we've got a response here, and that response is item created. So it does look as though that's worked. Now I just want to quickly run through that again. So in our template here, we set up this output. If we go into the terminal here, we're told whenever we build, we've got this value here, and that's our endpoint. So I've used that endpoint. Now notice that we've set the path here to /items. So we need to copy this here, go over to our Thunder client or Postman or whatever you're utilizing, and then make a new request. So this new request, we are adding, make sure we include post. So you copy and paste that link in, and then items at the end, that's the link. So once we've done that, go to your auth, set up AWS auth. So set your access key and your secret key, and then go to your body. Where am I? Just close this down. Then go to your body and then select JSON. And then here you can see the JSON that I'm using here. Now notice here that I've not defined, bring it down. No, I've not defined the ID or date. Because if I go back into my function, a Lambda function, that's doing it for me, remember. So here I'm defining the UUID4. So that's automatically going to be created, and the date added is also going to be created. So that's not something that I need to actually pass in. That's just going to be all created for me. Right, so item name, description, price is active. So let's go back into the workbench here, and I'm going to select items, and then I'm going to do a scan. And you can see I've now created a new item, a nice green apple, and that's got a price of 1. So I have now actually created a new product. So let's just go ahead and create a new product. Pair. So we'll just make a new pair. And we'll give this 1, yep. So we'll go send again. And you can see here we have a status here of new item created. So it looks like it was successful. So let's go back in and scan again. And now you can see that we're back with 2 items. So hopefully you are exactly there too. Now, if you do have any problems, it's just a case of no doubt just looking through the syntax of your code. And of course, like I said before, this code is in the video description if you want to follow this through and also utilize that to help and support your own code development. So that's that done. Right, that's probably the hardest part. Now we've got this up and running, it shouldn't be too difficult now to add the other components. So create, now return. So we want to return data. Okay, so back in your code, in your template, let's just drop in some code below here. This is just below the create product function. So just make sure everything is lined up here. So I'll just zoom in a little bit. So this is the list items function. So you can see we're using a function again, Lambda function. So we're provisioning a new Lambda function. You can see that we're going to use a folder called return items, and then handler app.lambda handler. Right, so we're using Python 3.9 again, And now let's have a look at the event. So this is an API. We're going to utilize the /items path again, but this time the method we're using is get, because we're going to get some data from the database. So we're going to send a get request. So we're going to set up our policy again, and that's pretty much it. You can see it's pretty much copy and paste of the previous. We're going to change the method and then also where the code resides. So we're going to make a new folder now in the RSRC. We're going to call this return items. So same process again. What's actually probably easier is if we just copy this into our folder. So we just copied from create items into the return items here. And let's just go into our app and we'll just make some amendments to this. So from the top then, we're not going to need JSON or UID here, and we're not going to need date. So all we're going to need here, we're going to need JSON. Okay. Right, so here then, we're going to create a new Lambda function. So that's all the same. HTTP method. Okay, so that's going to be slightly different then. So we're going to say HTTP method. Not in message or message HTTP, and this is going to be get. Okay, so if we don't send a get request, then we're just going to send a 400 status back to them saying that no, it's not the right request. And now we can move down. So the same thing again, table name and region, we can keep that the same. And we've got the item table here. So we're just setting out the resource to make that accessible so we can utilize our table. And then we set out our table again. Yep, so we just need a table and we're not capturing anything. So we don't need this. So remember, this is capturing the data that's being sent from the user, from the message. So we don't need that. And in addition to that, we don't need any parameters this time because we're just going to grab all the data. That's all we're going to do here. So in that respects, we've got table and now all we need to do is a response. So in this case, the response is really simple. The response here is just going to be table a dot scan. And there we go. So we're just going to grab everything from the table and then return that. So response status 200, and then we're going to say body JSON, and then we're going to return, let's return response items. Okay, and there we go. So with that in place, we can go through the same process again. Let's go for a build. And then once that's ready, we'll then go for a deploy. And then once that's done, we'll deploy the chain set. Now, deploying all these chain sets constantly, you will find eventually from utilizing this that it does seem to cause issues after a while. And that's when potentially the code, it just doesn't seem to perform correctly. There's a few changes that you might make and then nothing seems to generally work. And what might be useful is just to start again until you start to get a little bit more familiarized on how to actually deploy this without going through the process that we've done in this example. So it looks like everything is ready. So this we don't need to utilize Thunder Client, or we can just simply go into our browser. Let's go back to our browser, wherever that is. And then we can go ahead and just use our link, and then it should be just be items. And that should send that should return. There we go. So we've now returned all the items as expected. Of course, you could use Thunder Client here just to test that out, but that is good enough. We've returned in the code in the Lambda function, if you remember, we returned all the items. And yeah, there we go. So that's create and now return. So next up then is update. So again, similar process. Let's go for, first of all, let's create this new folder. Let's call this update items. And then we'll just go ahead and just copy everything from, put that right? Yeah, so we'll just go ahead and just copy everything from one of our apps here. So update. Okay, so let's go back into our template here. So we're going to need to provision a new Lambda function. So back in your template, just below the list items function, let's go ahead and add a new function here. And I'll just explain that. So this is called update item function. Again, it's going to be a Lambda function. Here we've got our link to our code. So we've just created that folder there, update items, plural. Okay, and then we're then using runtime Python again. So our event, so it's an API property. So this time then you can see here that we're going to use a property here just to extend the URL. So we're going to take in an ID here, and we're using a method put. So that's important. We'll see that in action shortly. So again, policies just as normal, and there we go. So that's our update function defined. So that should be provisioned. So let's go in now to our update items app, and let's take a look at what we need to do here. So this is going to be slightly different. So let's go ahead and have a look. So we're going to say body message, yep, message, and this time it's going to be put. Okay, so we're expecting a put request to this endpoint and then to be handled by this Lambda function. So we'll just send back a 400 bad request if it's not. And this time then, let's grab the table. Yep, so that's all the same. And then we provision our resource so we can access and utilize Dynamodb. Yep. And now we've got our table. So that's going to be all the same again. And this is where it starts to be slightly different. Right. So remember here we're doing an update. So what do we want to update? So we're not going to update the date, and we're not going to be updating the ID. Right, so generally what we're going to be updating is going to be the name, description, price, and is active, right? So that's generally going to be what's going to be happening here. So we'll just remove that for now. So what we're going to need to do here then is just set out ID and then say activity ID. Okay, so we're just grabbing from the body the ID. So that's what we've been doing previously. Remember, we send across it in JSON in the message body information, we grab it. Well, this time, if you remember, what we want to do, because we provisioned this new resource, this has this parameter here we want to pass in through the URL. We're going to use that. We're going to capture that to identify which item we want to change. So here we're going to say item ID equals, so how you do that is item ID equals, and then it's going to be message. So in the message, we're going to look for path parameters, and then we're going to grab the parameter, and that parameter is called ID. So we're going to grab the ID parameter. So then what we're going to do is we're then going to pass that in. So we go ahead and pass that in as the ID in this parameter. So we set up our parameters. We can then utilize that in our query. Okay, so now we've got that in place. Let's go ahead and have a look at this response. So this is going to be quite different. Right, response equals, and then table, and then it's update item, right? So we're going to pass in our key. So we're going to say key equals params. So that's our key, and that allows us to identify which item in our table, in our database, that we want to change. And obviously we're going to pass that in through the URL, capture that, and pass that in. Right, so we got that. Now we need expression attribute values. I think attribute attribute values. Okay, so that's going to equal. So now we just need to find what attributes we want to change. So if you remember, there's 4: item name, description, price, and is active. So where I got those from, remember, is that that's what we're trying to pass in from our API when we create items. So we can see here that that's essentially what we're going to try and pass in. So that's what should be in the database. So that's what we're going to try and change. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so here we are just defining the data type, and then we're grabbing from the JSON that is going to be sent across. We're just grabbing that information and then extracting that back out, and then that's then defining what we want to change in the database. Right. So it looks like there's an error here. So go on, comma. Expression key. So we need a comma right here. There we go. Okay, right. So with that in place, Let's go ahead now and return values equals updated new. Okay, right, so print a response and then status code 200, and then this time we're going to send a message item updated. There we go. Right, so with that in place, we should now be ready to build. So go ahead, same process again, build and deploy. So that's the build and then deploy. So I've received an error. So we're saying here that terminal blah blah expression status failed, status failed, reason template format error. So it looks like we've got some sort of format error, which should be fairly simple to resolve. So resource dependencies item table. Okay, so it looks like potentially the problem is here. So let's take a look. So this was the, bring this down a bit, item table. So here, for example, at the bottom, it says items table in template. So I think that should be items. Yeah, there should be items table. So that looks like what the problem is there. So that's fairly simple to resolve. It did direct us fairly well there. So hopefully we can go ahead and build again and then deploy. So it looks like we're all okay. So we'll go ahead and deploy that chain set. So assuming that was successful, we should now be ready to go back into our Thunder client or whatever you're using. And here I'm going to set, you can create a new request here. We've got the URL here again, if you need that. So here we're going to utilize put. Okay, right. So you can see that I don't use that that often. It just seems to be quite handy. Right, so let's I want to drop that down. Okay, anyway, so here we have our endpoint. So for put, so that's going to be items. Okay, and then we've got this number. So we're going to pass in this extra attribute here, remember, parameter. So what we're going to need to know is what the ID is of one of our products. So we're going to need to go back into back in here, and then let's just grab one of these IDs. So we'll grab this first item here. So this is the ID. So we're going to utilize this here, and we're going to need to use that right at the end here. Okay, so that's that. So that's going to be captured nicely. So now let's go ahead and set the item name. So same process again in the body, JSON. Let's go and add the JSON here. So I want to change the price to 2. So the original price here is what we've got for the pair is, it looks like it's 1. So the price is 1. So I'm going to change the price to 2. That's the plan. Right, so just make sure again that the auth, AWS auth has been set up your body, and then go for a send, and then what we got. So it says no method found matching root items for put. Okay, right, so it looks like we've got a few issues here. So the reason why that is because I haven't actually copied this, have I? I've just used this old one. So let's go back here in template, in our console here. Just make sure we're actually using the right URL. That would be handy. So let's just grab and put that there. Okay, so let's now send now, and it still says no matching root found. Okay, so let's go back in and just double check our root. So it should be item. So how we set that up properly? So here it says items. So we just missed out the plural there, the yes. So let's just try and see if we can use item, see if that works. And we seem to have an internal server error. Okay, so that's good. I'm happy with that. So let's go ahead and just go back into here. Let's change that to items, and we'll just go for a rebuild. just to build some consistency here. So we go for another build, we'll make that change. And then we go for a deploy. Okay, so this is where it starts to fall down and we start to have big problems. So here now we have a failed to deploy, automatic rollback disabled for this deployment. And we did set that up so we couldn't roll back. So we've got issues here. So actions you can take next, fix issues and try to deploy again, roll back stack to the last known state. So failed to create, update the stack. Right, so clearly there's some kind of big issues now that we've got here. So let's take a look at see what we can do. So I will apologize if you're expecting just a straightforward, get everything working, everything's okay. What we're going to do now is just clean this up. And we're going to go through this step by step. And also we're going to be utilizing and doing this in a manual way. Now, this is just trying to get us familiarized with some of these services that we're utilizing here. So remember, we've got our Dynamo, right? So this is our table. So if we want to remove tables, just go over to Dynamo, type it in here in services. Let's go ahead and just remove this first. Right, so we're going to be having to type in delete there. So that gets rid of that service. So remember, that's the kind of the first component here. Now, AWS IAM, there's nothing really we need to do at this point there for this process at least. So we've now got rid of our table. So let's now think about Lambda. Right, so let's go into Lambda. Okay, you can see there's loads of stuff here. So let's go ahead and just delete all this. So that's going to remove all our Lambda functions. So we now have 0 Lambda functions. So that's this component here, the Lambda functions. Now the gateway. So let's go into our gateway. That's it. Sorry, the API gateway. Jumping around there. Still didn't click on the right one. Okay, so let's just get rid of our API gateways. So we'll just go ahead and delete. Okay, too many requests. Right, so let's go ahead and delete that again. Too many requests, so we need to wait a little bit of time before we do that. So whilst we're waiting for that, what we can do is go into our last component. And that's CloudFormation. Actually, I've given it a bit of time now. Let's quickly see if I can delete that. Yeah. Okay, so I've got rid of my gateway. So CloudFormation, create and manage resources with templates. That's what we've been doing. And we've got 3 stacks here. So you can see we've got this update fail. It looks like that's what was the problem we were having earlier. But I'm just really trying to show you how to clean it up manually. At least this way, it gives you a more comprehensive understanding that there are other ways of cleaning and working with the AWS CLI for this, of course, but hopefully this gives you a kind of a better insight. So let's go ahead and delete these stacks. So you can see it takes a little bit of a while for it to delete. So that's going to take maybe 10, 20 seconds to do that. You've seen already, if you try and delete too many things with other resources, it will prevent you from doing that. So whilst that's deleting, there is a last component that isn't in this list, and that was S3. Remember, we're storing the data in our S3. So let's go ahead and go to our scalable storage, simple storage. And you can see we have this bucket here, which represents what we created to store our data. So if we go inside of here, we're going to just need to get rid of what's inside first. So let's do that. And then once you've done that, we can come back, close that, and let's go back into our buckets here, and let's just go ahead and delete that. So we can't do that because we need to empty the bucket. So let's just make sure we can do that. Now notice if I do that, it won't let me do that. So I'm going to type in permanently delete. There we go. So we've deleted everything there. So we'll exit that, and we shouldn't have. Yep. So okay. Looks like we've got something else there. So let's go ahead and objects found. Okay. So I didn't refresh. That's why. Okay, so I've got, well, there's nothing here. Okay, just refresh that. So there's nothing in there. For some reason, it's causing an error. Just try and delete that again. Okay. So let's just go ahead and delete this. There we go. So that removes all the buckets. Let's go back into the cloud formation, see if that's now done. Yep, so we no, there's just one more. So we've got a delete issue here, delete failed. So we'll give that a go again. Okay, so we've deleted the bucket now, I think. So slow. Okay. Don't think it exists anymore. We just deleted that. So hopefully that should now delete. And then that leaves us back to where we started. And there we go, no stack. So we've completely removed everything that we have accomplished so far. So let's go through the process again of setting this up. Right, so back in here then, I'm just going to make sure that I'm in the right folder. So I'm just going to remove, I'm just going to cd ... to come out of that folder. So I'm now inside of this root here instead of inside of this folder. Right, so with that in place, let's go through the same process again. And this just gives us a reminder, if you like, and makes us hopefully feel a little bit more comfortable utilizing this technology. So we're going to say Sam initialize. Oh, sorry, we don't need that. Sam initialize and then name. So we're going to call this new API, new item API. There we go. So we're going to use a template still. In this case, I will make some more tutorials on this testing, for example, I want to cover for this and expanding on this and utilizing more of this technology. So we're going to use a Hello World example here and then say, yes, we're using Python. So that's going to clone that down and make that new project folder. Okay, so we have the new project folder. Excellent. So next up then, if you remember, we just need to go into that folder. So cd into that folder. So cd new item API. And then from here, we're going to say Sam deploy guided. So this is the second thing that we did. Now, one might imagine, if you kind of see what's happening here, that first step we just took, what just happened there? Essentially, all we did was we made a folder and we've then gone ahead and downloaded a Git repository. Well, if we didn't do that and went into this folder and applied Sam deploy guided, then aren't we just doing the same thing there? So hopefully you can kind of see where that's leading to. Right, so now we're inside of this folder, this new folder here. We're going to now Sam deploy and use guided. So the stack name, we're just going to call this Sam app items API. And then region same, confirm before deploy, yes. Allow Sam CLI IMO roles creation. Yep, we want to do that. Disable rollback, I'm still saying yes for that. And then yes to that and yes to that. And then that's the configuration for that. Enter, enter. And now we're going to then deploy that. Right, so once that's done, we'll then go ahead and take a look. Okay, so that was successful. And we should have our URL endpoint here. So let's give that a go. Go back over here. So everything was okay. So we're back to where we began. Right, so with that in place, we have our code here, remember? So what we can now do, this is the old code that we utilize here. Let's go ahead and just remove in the new folder, the new API. Let's get rid of the hello world and let's get rid of, we don't need tests for now. So we'll just get rid of that. And then the template file, well, we'll get rid of the template file and then the README file. Won't need that. And then there we go. So that's kind of an empty project for us to then drop in our src. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll move that in there to our new item. And then we're just moving our template over here. And that's pretty much all that we need to change or to add there. So once that's in place, Let's now go ahead and we'll do a SAM build. And then we do a SAM deploy. So that's going to take a couple of seconds. There's quite a lot there for it to provision, of course. I think the three different functions and the database. Okay, so that's now all been provisioned. So let's test this out, of course. So we're going to need our new endpoint. So let's utilize that. Let's go into the Thunder client again. So we're going to use post first to build some new items. So that's going to be that, then items, and then it's going to be the same code as before. So we're going to add a new item here in the body. Remember, you're going to need auth still if you haven't set it up. So let's go ahead and send. And there we go, new item created. Good. So that seems to be okay. So let's utilize this right here. Let's go into our browser and then just make sure that that's worked okay. There we go. So we've added a new item. So let's just make sure we can now, what do we do next? We posted, we've create return. Let's now go for update. Right, so let's go on to the update. Let's just make sure that we've set this right. So that's the end point here, items. And now we're going to need an item, of course. So let's just grab our item here, the ID. So grab the ID, pass it in there in the URL, and then we're going to change the price of the apple to 2. So let's give that a go. So this time we still have an internal error. So this was expected because I want to show this other diagnostic tool. Here we're not going to get much information, and that's not very useful, of course. There's nothing in the terminal here. So let's go back into our service. So what we're looking for then, let's go into the, let's go into, first of all, the API gateway. Let's have a look at this. So in our API gateway here, this is our app, the items API. So here we have a list of all the endpoints that we have available, and we're trying to utilize put, right? So here we can go for a little test. So we know, let's just close that one. We know that our ID is this right here. Okay, so that's our ID. So let's go back here. And so that's what we're going to pass in. So in the body, well, let's just go back to our code here, just to find what we're going to be updating. So we give that a go. So we put that in there. So that's what we want to update. And let's go for a test. So here we're going to get a much more information. So if we run down here at the bottom, so Lambda execution failed, status 200 due to customer function error. Expression values can only be expressed when using expressions. So, and condition expressions are null. Right, so, okay, so it definitely looks like we've got an error here with the code somewhere. So it's now just a case of trying to work it out. So generally, you're going to get enough information here. 200 due to customer function error. Okay. So hopefully that's given you some insight on how to find a little bit more information when there are errors. So let's see if we can now resolve this problem. So it's going to be in our SRC, the update items. This is where the problem's going to be, somewhere here. Right, so there's something missing here, right? So this is what the problem is. Now, generally what happens, if you do come from a relational database world, generally what happens when you try to input something, you define what fields you want to input into, and then you define the data. And that's what is missing here, right? So what we're going to need to do here is define the update expression. Okay, so that equals, and then we just set the item name equals. So we're just defining that as a string. Description, or if you're coming from like a PHP world, this is very kind of similar to how you would set this up. We're doing description. Sorry, I went into a different world then. I do get a lot of one or two questions from users saying you do stumble a lot. That's because I don't have a script. We just roll. We just get this code. Sometimes I pre-code things. So description, price, like you've seen, and that's just saves a little bit of time. And I do that as we go along. And also I'm thinking about what to tell you, what might be useful for you. And it doesn't always come out very well. Eventually, hopefully we get to a point where the channel is big enough to then think about scripting and making things a little bit more polished. Hopefully you've enjoyed this idea of reworking an application and the idea of having issues. I try to show as many issues as possible and help you start to resolve them, because ultimately that's where you're going to spend a lot of your time. So, okay, so we said set item name equals, so we've got an error here somewhere, description string price number is active string, right? So we need a comma. So that's the issue, right? So now we defined what fields we're going to enter and the data. Hopefully now, when we go ahead and build and deploy, this is going to work. Actually, it's just worth mentioning. Just going to tab that in and just do a build again. And then a deploy. Looks like we're good to go. So I'll go ahead and deploy that. So that's been deployed now. So let's go back into our update here. So we're back here, then we've added the put, we've got put here. We've got our URL. Remember, we're passing the ID. So let's give this a go. Fingers crossed. I am expecting this to work. If it doesn't, yeah, okay. So we've now sorted this. So we now updated the item. So we can obviously go and check that. Let's go back here. So we changed the price from 1 to 2 in this instance. So I refresh here and it's changed to 2. So that gives you an idea, hopefully, of how you can now update. So that's great, return and update. So finally then delete. So let's get back into your templates at the bottom here. I'm just going to copy this in. Right, so here we have the delete item function. Again, it's going to be another function. So we're going to be using a folder delete items, Python 3.9, and then we've got a path here. So notice this time we're using the same path again as we did previously, items, and then we're going to pass in ID. And then this time, instead of using put, we're going to use delete as the method here. Right, so we refer to the items table. I think that's right, items, yep. So that's the items table. And there we go. So that's our last provision. So let's go back into here, create a new folder. We're going to call that delete items. Let's just go ahead and let's take return. And we're going to copy return into delete here. And let's go into our app. Right, so this is really, really simple. So we're going to use the same tools as before, path parameters. So path parameters. So if we haven't included a path parameter this time, so it checks for that. Or this time we're using delete. So if we haven't gone to this endpoint using a delete request, then we're going to return to say it's a bad request. Okay, so table, yep, and then we're going to use the item table. So we're using the item table again, and then this time we're going to need to pass in the parameter, the ID parameter again. So let's say item ID equals, and then let's grab the ID. So we grab that, and then we're going to need some parameters. So let's pass that into our params. So let's get rid of that. So params equals, and then that's going to be ID, and that's going to be item ID. Okay, so that sets that up, and then we just need essentially the query, right? So that's going to be response equals table that we've defined already, and then that's going to be delete item. Okay, so what do we want to delete? Well, that depends on the key. So let's just pass in the key parameters. Okay, so we're going to pass in the key in the URL, and then we're going to pass it over to here, and then that params. And then that's going to then delete the item with that key. And that's pretty much it, to be honest. Yeah, 200. And then the message, we go for a message this time rather than a dump. So that's going to be message. And we're going to send a message back saying item deleted. There we go. So that looks like it's ready to go. Yep. Okay, so let's go into our terminal then, and we'll go ahead and build and deploy for the final time. And then deploy. A question I had, maybe not for you folks, but where do I get all these commands so quickly? How do I type them in so quickly? So do you remember that at least in this terminal, it will save previous commands. So I'm pressing up and down, and that's going to return the previous commands. Okay, right, so we're ready to deploy. So we'll give that a couple of seconds, and then we'll give that a go. So while we're waiting for that, let's just go ahead and create our endpoint here. So the update, we'll use the update URL for our delete. So we'll just update that one. So here we're using the URL that's going to be provided to us shortly. And then we know what the ID of the product is. And just make sure that we're using items for this. So items, yeah. And then that's the endpoint. So the headers, this time there's nothing we need to do in the headers. Okay, oh, sorry, the body. There's nothing we need to add in the body here. Remember, we're just going to pass this in. It's going to do the magic for us. And then just remember, we're going to need the auth as well. So the access key and the secret key has been set up. And then once that's done, we would quickly fire this off to see if it works. So it looks like we're good to go. So let's just fire this off, see if it works. And there we go, item deleted. So hopefully now, if we then refresh this page, we won't have an item. And there we go. So let's just make sure that that works okay by running. And this is a benefit of having and saving your endpoints here to test them. So I'll post here. Let's just go ahead and run this again, see if we can create a new item. And then we'll run our refresh. And there we go. And there we go, CRUD with Amazon Lambda Functions, utilizing a serverless infrastructure. Now, if you did like this format, I did try to provide as many issues as possible, and that's not always preferable for some people. They like to basically just go through step by step. Hopefully that was useful. Please let me know in the comments. If you do have any questions, please leave them in the comments, but be careful of what you ask, because I don't want to spend half an hour answering a question, writing out an answer, to a question. So try and keep them nice and short, and I'll try and get back to you. Now, if you do have any other comments about the delivery or maybe suggestions for future tutorials, then please let me know. It's always useful to know actually if you don't like things and why you wouldn't subscribe, for example, to the channel. That's always useful to know, because that's how we get better. And unless I get that feedback, it's never going to get better potentially. So please be as critical as possible. So thank you very much again for listening. Hopefully you got to the end here, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.